All right, YouTube, Texas lawmakers have joined the increasing rallying cry of many other, mostly red states, to call forth a state convention on the U.S. Constitution. What do I think about this? It's both a good and a very bad idea. It's a good idea if it's constrained in form. My worry is that if a bunch of states decide to call such a convention, and nobody is making sure that they're doing the right thing, people aren't amalgamated enough to demand that some of that effort is used to give them more individual liberty, to reduce federal abuse without simply making it state abuse, which could happen. My worry is that that's exactly what would occur, which is that the states go in, they'd lambaste the federal government by designing new amendments, they'd rob the federal government of much of its power, return it to the states, but then the states could be abusive and there'd no longer be any significant recourse other than the ballot box, which might no longer be of any real use. That would be my worry. But I would strongly support this move and would actively campaign on its behalf in my own state and try to get others to do it so as much as possible with every ounce of my effort. If, and only if, two things happen. The states that are participating in a move to call forth such a convention agree upon beforehand the specific issues that they're working towards, and those issues that they're working towards include expanding protections of individual liberty, not just states' rights. If it's just a states' rights thing, it's pointless, because they'll be just as abusive as the federal government, only they'll be even less easily held to account potentially, because there's no longer a federal government to potentially remove that abuse if the need arises and a reform movement is present. Number two, the people in these states and all other states largely agree in spirit that that needs to happen. It would need, for instance, I can imagine some things that could happen. An expansion of the Second Amendment to specifically delineate that individuals are the militia. Doesn't mean a standing army. And this is true. This is the authentic historical tradition. When the founders designed the Second Amendment, was the militia was the private population capable of being mustered, as opposed to the regulars, which was a standing military that at the time didn't even exist. And if they wanted to reframe that and expand upon the Second Amendment, specifically delineate, yes, all small arms are protected, I would support that. That'd be a good idea. An expansion of the First and Fourth Amendments to apply specifically and explicitly to all electronic forms of expression and correspondence, I would absolutely support that. That'd be wonderful. To put it only under the purview of states, if at all, even situationally. That'd be great. An expansion of the 10th Amendment to return much of the ability to levy taxes, to levy fees, and create any bureaucratic fiber at all to the states, to remove it from the federal government. I would absolutely support that. My worry is that they would go further. My worry is that they would take powers unto themselves that the federal government currently uses to abuse people. And that wouldn't be good. It would be pointless. It'd still be abuse. It would just be coming from a lower level. Any bureaucratic fixtures handled at a state level can potentially be more efficient, specifically because there's more accountability, especially within small states. You get a state like Vermont, rural, largely, smaller population and land area. Yeah, there's a good chance that you see your mayor or your governor on the street. Texas, California, some of the larger, more populated states, not so much. They live a more sheltered lifestyle and have the limos and stuff and the private guards. So my worry would be that the abuse wouldn't go away, that they're perceiving. They're right when they say, yeah, the federal government's gotten way too large, way too abusive, we need to do something about it. I fully support that, and a states convention could solve the problem. The problem would be, if they call it, the abuse may simply go from being federal level to state level, in which case, what's the point? If there's no, the real constraint you want is more individual liberty, to protect individuals and their private associations. States should come a distant second, and the federal government should come in last place. I agree with them when they say the federal government is overburdensome. It does need to be shrunk. I would suggest as well a constitutional amendment creating an electoral system at the federal level, which involves an absolute and total ban on donations from any non-individual entity. Only individuals should donate to political campaigns. It should be a single person, single donation, capped at some reasonable arbitrary level, which can adjust over time, maybe for inflation or deflation or whatever. That would make sense, in addition to a small amount of public funding to run debates and so forth. That's the form our election should take. If they implemented something like that, it'd be legendary, because that solves half of our problems as a nation right off the bat. Another thing that I would suggest is to prevent things like mass surveillance, rob the federal government of that ability, and don't even give it to the states. It shouldn't be occurring at all. As well as perhaps a constitutional amendment, and this would be less likely since most of these are red states, to ban moral laws that don't really need to be enforced, at least at the federal level. If the states get to pick and choose whether they're delving into moralism, at the very least, there will always be some states with more common sense than others on any given issue. I guess that could work. It's less abusive because you can always get away from it and move states. Some people don't have the economic capability to do so in this day and age. But then again, if you did severely shrink federal power, we'd probably be much more wealthy as well. So I guess it could, in a way, work, because you'd have a much larger middle class that would be much better off. There'd be fewer poor individuals. You'd be easily able to fund programs for them, even at the federal level, if you maintain them, because it'd be a lot cheaper. I also envision, and this would be the holy grail of a constitutional amendment, permanently cap the maximum tax burden that is allowable for individuals to have to experience on business, self-employment, individual personal income in various brackets. There should be a threshold beyond which the combined taxation of the federal and state governments should not be able to exceed. There should be a permanently capped level for that. There is no excuse for it to be higher than a reasonable level. We're already well beyond it. It should be capped. If you're going to rob the federal government of much of its power, you also need to. This would be a suggestion for these states. If you do call this state convention, and it's possible that you'll be successful in getting enough states to do so, it's possible to do so. You're only a few states away right now, potentially. If you do, you must attempt to implement a constitutional amendment to limit the tax burden that between states and the federal government at the maximum possible allowable level can be experienced. Because otherwise, the federal government's going to keep siphoning away huge amounts of money, only now you've robbed it of most of its functions. It no longer even has a justification for it. It'll hold it over your heads and blackmail you like it does with drinking laws. Like the age that you're allowed to drink at is 21. But it's not 21 because the federal government forces it to be 21. It's 21 because the federal government threatens to withhold highway funding from states that lower it further. That's the reason that it's 21. By all rights, it should be 18. Hell, there shouldn't even be a drinking age. Who fucking cares? It's not like somebody who's significantly younger, they're not going to get behind the wheel, generally speaking. Let them have a beer. Who cares? I don't agree with any moral laws. But the federal government will still siphon that money and withhold it from you and force you to do what it wants in a monetary sense if you just expand states' rights without robbing the federal government permanently of its ability to overtax your population. It'll just raise taxes across the board. It'll vote in higher taxes, and then it'll say, oh, we got all these programs for states, but they are requisite upon you adopting certain laws. That is exactly what they will do. It's the ultimate workaround that the federal government has always had. You can cut off the head of the snake and prevent it from ever doing that again with a constitutional amendment that caps federal taxes and also strictly constrains it to certain types of tax. Federal government shouldn't have anything to do with implementing most of the fees and taxes that it implements. Should be a single personal income tax with a simplistic bracket system capped at some very small level. And that provides for your military and the rudiments of legal order in federal form, as well as the salaries of Senate and House and the President and so forth. That's what it should be providing for. Those are really, there aren't many functions that the federal government specifically needs to have. I agree with Texas, and I agree with all these, in some cases, evangelical states on this issue. My worry is simply that you'll go further than these good suggestions, and or you won't actually fully implement some of the more important suggestions, and it'll just be a freak show. You'll just expand the 10th Amendment, give yourselves more power. The federal government's still going to hold money over your heads. They'll just raise taxes. That final proposition is probably the most important of all, that and campaign finance reform. The states would not have enough leeway if those two aren't passed. because the federal government has those two workarounds. It can screw around with the election system to deny office to people with good ideas, or it can simply raise the tax burden, which siphons wealth out of the states and then returns the wealth back, but only if you follow their rules. It's an extremely dirty game that they play. It's wrong. It should be unconstitutional anyway for them to do this, but the courts are, at the federal level, of course, are on their side. They want their paychecks too. So you'd have to pass such an amendment. Otherwise, you're going nowhere. These other amendments wouldn't even matter. You'd say, oh yeah, the Second Amendment provides for X, Y, and Z, and so forth. They'd say, okay, yeah, we're raising taxes. Oh, by the way, we're going to give you a lot of this money back, but you're going to pass this ordinance on what kind of bullets you can use, what kind of guns you can own. Oh, we're not saying you have to, but I mean, if you want this money, you're going to have to pony up, so to speak. They've done this before. They do this with the drinking age. They do it with many things. So that's my suggestion. I would support it, but only if they go in spirit agreeing that it'll be constrained to certain issues, and only if they have at least a few of these very good ideas to show for it. Otherwise, it's just the states want to abuse you instead of the federal government, in which case, what's the point? It's still abuse. It's barely better by a very, very small and almost seemingly invisible margin. That's about all. Peace out.